I never thought a simple decision about Christmas morning would spiral into something that felt like a living nightmare, but here we are. My husband and I had always imagined our children waking up to a sea of colorful wrapping paper, their laughter and innocence filling the air like the smell of fresh pine from our tree. So, when my husband's parents were insistent about joining us to watch our kids open their gifts, I hesitated, not because I didn't want them there, but because of the dark, quiet secrets that always seemed to surface whenever I spent time with them. See, my in-laws have this unsettling ability to twist every joyful occasion into an underlying tension, an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. The first Christmas we spent together, they arrived early, their smiles stretched too wide, their eyes too focused on my every move as I tried to set the scene of holiday cheer, and I remember my daughter's joyous squeal being overshadowed by a comment from my mother-in-law about how children shouldn't be spoiled with so much. That experience pushed me to set boundaries, and I was firm this year. I want this to be a special moment just for us, I told my husband, who reluctantly agreed, aware of the strange weight our in-laws carried in our lives, almost like a curse that cast shadows over even the happiest days. But then Christmas morning arrived, and my excitement quickly turned into dread when I saw a text from my mother-in-law at 5 a.m., saying she couldn't wait to see them, her unwavering enthusiasm creeping under my skin like ice. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered like a storm cloud as I sipped my coffee, the aroma mingling with the unmistakable scent of impending chaos. I insisted to my husband that the whole family could come over later, after the presents, but he had that look, one of silent defiance, as if stepping into the battlefield to protect what little peace we had left. As the hour approached for the kids to wake, I went into survival mode, meticulously hand-picking the ornaments our daughter had decorated the night before, but the glee in my heart felt hollow. The little ones bounded in, their eyes sparkling brighter than any Christmas light, and I could almost forget the impending doom at my back, that is, until the doorbell rang just when they were about to dive into the pile of gifts. I froze, breath hitching in my throat. My husband shot me a panicked look, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I could only imagine who stood on the other side. Sure enough, there they were, my in-laws, faces beaming, clutching bags filled with their own presents, as if it were theirs to share. My body reacted instinctively. I stepped in front of the kids as if I could shield them from this intruding wave, all my intentions to keep Christmas pure unraveling before my eyes. We agreed, I stuttered, my voice barely a whisper but sharp enough for them to hear. We wanted today just for our family. For a brief moment, there was silence, and I could see my father-in-law's smile falter, flickering like a muted TV screen in a dark room, but then my mother-in-law's expression twisted, and it made me physically recoil. Sweetheart, she said in that deceptively soft tone that made my skin crawl, you don't want to spoil the holiday spirit, do you? My husband stepped up to diffuse the tension, but a knot tightened in the pit of my stomach, and before I knew it, I was leading the children upstairs, almost dragging them from the scene that morphed into an argument between my husband and his parents, a battle of wills that would shatter the already fragile thread of our Christmas. I tucked the kids under my arms like precious jewels, whispering to them that everything would be okay, but their wide eyes mirrored the confusion I felt too. I could almost hear my own heart pounding above the muffled shouts from downstairs, like a metronome marking the passage of time, and despite knowing we were safe up there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was brewing just out of sight. When I heard silence settle like dust in the aftermath of their words, I finally ventured down the hallway, only to witness the scene of my husband sitting on the couch, face pale, looking utterly broken as his parents stood above him, faces still twisted with that disconcerting blend of disappointment and determination to claim their power. I can't believe you'd deny your children this happiness, my mother-in-law hissed. My mind spiraled, torn between wanting to run back upstairs and wanting to protect my husband from this mental assault, but when I stepped into the room, all eyes turned to me, and I instantly regretted it. Look what you're doing to him, I shouted before thinking, and my voice echoed like a bell in a deserted abbey, cutting their glares into shards that sliced at the very fabric of our family. My husband's eyes flickered to me with a strange mixture of shame and longing, the pleading look in them begging me to stop, but there was no stopping it now. The moment had escalated into chaos, civil war waged over the rights to Christmas morning, and I felt the darkness closing in around us, a smothering shroud threatening to choke the life out of my children's excitement. I couldn't take it, couldn't breathe in that suffocating atmosphere filled with resentment, and I grabbed my kids, ushering them back upstairs, with a scream trapped in my throat. My heart pounded as our little family barricaded ourselves in, the noise of their increasingly furious voices fading into the background until all I could hear was the sound of my children's confused whispers. I tried to reassure them with soft words, but how could I explain the evils that lurked outside that door? My husband joined us moments later, yet the defeat on his face was a mirror reflecting the horrible reality. This year's Christmas was shattered, our joy stolen, and as he pulled us together, it felt like a fragile house of cards, just waiting for one more gust of wind to take it down. Hours passed, my stomach twisted in knots while the sun crept into the sky, illuminating the shadows of our crumbling home until finally, we heard the door slam. A rush of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived when my husband dared to open the door. When he peeked out, I quickly felt something dark brewing in his gaze, the kind that made my heart sink into my stomach. He turned to me, eyes glazed with disbelief, and whispered, "They're gone." The heaviness in the air was almost tangible, and I knew, in that instant, that things would never be the same. We came together, holding our children close, but the feeling of dread never left. How could we ever celebrate Christmas the same? Each year afterwards became a reminder of that singular moment, wrestling against the ropes of doubt and discontent that our own families tied around us, leaving my husband and I in a constant battle to keep our children's innocence untarnished while the darkness of anger and grief loomed just beyond the walls. I realized with a sinking heart that Christmas wasn't merely a day, it became a symbol, a battleground in my mind, a reminder that in-laws could bring a darkness unlike any other, slowly creeping in like a thief of joy, and whether it was worth the cost of keeping them away on that one single day would haunt me for the years to come. Last Thanksgiving, I found myself in a moral quandary that still chills my bones when I think back on it. My girlfriend, Mia, had a cherished family tradition of gathering every year at her grandmother's sprawling old house in the woods, a house that everyone claimed was haunted, though Mia always laughed it off as just a local legend. This year, however, I had planned a weekend fishing trip with my friends, something we had organized weeks in advance and were all looking forward to. I felt torn. Should I attend the obligatory family gathering where I'd be the outsider, or honor my pre-existing commitment? In a moment of selfishness, I chose my friends over her family's tradition, hoping it wouldn't cause too many ripples in our relationship. As soon as I made the decision, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I was already feeling bad when I woke up Thanksgiving morning to a deluge of messages and missed calls from Mia, her voice frantic as she told me her grandmother had fallen ill and there wouldn't be any gathering. Instead, she encouraged me to enjoy my trip, but guilt clawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been supportive enough. The fishing trip was almost as disappointing as it was cathartic. Every cast of my line reminded me of the warmth of family, and all I could picture was Mia's disappointment plastered across her face. As the day dragged on, though, I dismissed my worries, shrugging them off with my friends, feigning laughter as they told ghost stories around the campfire. But as night swallowed the camp in darkness, I noticed something odd, a sudden, chilling silence in the woods. The crickets stopped their chirping, and the wind held its breath. I could swear I felt eyes watching us from the shadows. Unease settled like lead in my stomach. In an attempt to shake the feeling, I stepped away from the fire, venturing into the trees on the pretext of needing to find a restroom. It wasn't long before I found myself walking deeper into the woods than intended, the moonlight barely cutting through the branches overhead. Each step was heavy, as if something sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the dim light. I turned back, heart racing, but that's when I heard the first of the whispers, soft, echoey, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Come play with us," it called, in a sing-song voice that sent icy chills down my spine. My blood ran cold as I immediately thought of the ghost stories my friends were telling. What if we had ventured too far into something that shouldn't be disturbed? I quickened my pace, trying to shake it off, but the whispers followed me back, only growing louder and more insistent. I stumbled upon what looked like an old, decrepit shack, forgotten and crumbling, draped with vines. It felt like a bad idea, but something pulled me closer, against my better judgment. Knocking on the rotten door, I felt an unnatural chill seep through my skin. The door creaked open without my touch, revealing an empty room consumed by shadows, where sunlight dared not intrude. I hesitated but stepped inside, curiosity overpowering fear. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, every instinct screamed for me to leave, but the whispers had morphed into a haunting melody that enchanted me. I turned towards a dim glimmer at the back, only for the door to slam shut behind me, locking me in darkness. Panic surged as I rattled the door, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The whispers turned to gasps, a cacophony that reverberated off the walls. Then, just like that, they formed words: "You shouldn't have come here. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw them, children, their faces pale and hollowed, drifting through the cracks in the walls, their eyes void of warmth, staring into my soul. "You're not supposed to be here," one of them whispered, clutching my leg with a cold, trembling hand. I felt sick. This place was a prison, a nightmare trapped inside a nightmare, echoing with the spirits of those who had lost their way. I fought against the whispers, pushed against the walls of darkness, the memory of Mia losing its hold on me as the weight of despair thickened the air. I couldn't let her down, but I felt tethered to this cursed place, as if its despair were latching onto my essence. Just then, I heard footsteps outside. My friends had come looking for me. I cried out, "Help me!" But my voice was drowned in the whispers. The door rattled as they struggled to open it. And, in a moment of clarity, I realized I had to fight back against whatever this place was trying to take from me. Summoning my last reserve of strength, I hurled against the door one final time, battering it as cold fingers released their hold. I felt space open up, light cutting through the darkness. My friends pushed through, pulling me into the safety of the night. Breathless and trembling, I fell to my knees, gasping for air while the shack stood ominously behind us, silent and still. I could still hear the whispers as they faded, mingling with the wind. "You shouldn't have come," echoed softly. Shaken, I collected myself as my friends were confused, asking what had happened. I only managed to tell them I'd gotten lost when I realized I'd been gone too long. I didn't dare tell them about the whispers, about the children, about the darkness, fearing they might have walked into our very own horror story. The next day, I returned to Mia, guilt seeping into every moment. When she asked how my trip went, I smiled faintly and said it was good, suppressing the fear clawing at my insides. A few days later, her family sent out a notice that they would be selling the old house. Apparently, her grandmother had died the night I'd gotten lost. The unease returned, wrapping its fingers around my throat as the fog of dread settled back in. I realized then that I was haunted not just by the spirits of that place, but by the decision I'd made, the choice to ignore something important, something that cost more than just a gathering. To this day, the whispers linger in the back of my mind, a reminder of the tradition I snubbed, the pain I caused. I sometimes wonder if part of me is still trapped inside that shack, lost among the shadows, and I can't help but bring it up to my friends, hoping they will understand someday. But deep down, I know the truth, it's too late for that. I never thought a simple issue like punctuality could unravel my life in such a terrifying way, but here I am, staring blankly at my phone, the glint of the screen reflecting my dread as I anticipate their all-too-familiar late arrival. My in-laws, the Johnsons, have turned tardiness into an art form. You see, it's not just the usual 15 minutes late, but often an hour, 2 hours, or sometimes not at all. Yes, they've pulled that stunt too, leaving me waiting in the restaurant, awkwardly pretending to enjoy a glass of wine while I wonder if they've been kidnapped by aliens or simply decided they'd rather binge-watch Friends than honor my dinner invitation. It's been years of this, and I've reached my breaking point. After yet another instance of me pacing the restaurant like a caged animal, I snapped and texted them a harsh message before this latest dinner with my wife's family: "If you can't make it on time, don't come at all." When they finally arrived, nearly an hour late, my father-in-law's face twisted in confusion, while my mother-in-law tutted softly, like a schoolteacher reprimanding a particularly dull student, but I didn't back down when they stormed out, leaving the restaurant empty and echoing our abandoned table. The rest of the evening was a tense silence at home, the air thick with my wife's disappointment, which turned to anger after she received a text from her mother, suggesting her husband was a monster who couldn't handle a few minor inconveniences. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of my wife on her phone, her whispered arguments and the occasional near sob causing shadows to loom taller in our bedroom, until, at last, she turned toward me and refused to speak, her back a cold wall of resentment. Days went by after this explosive dinner, leaving me isolated and uncertain, with strings of tension that felt heavier than the very air I breathed, filling our home with an oppressive silence that buzzed around me. I started noticing things. Maybe my nerves were getting to me, but every time I walked past my in-laws' house, the curtains would twitch just a little too much, and I could swear I saw shadows that felt out of place, as if someone was always watching, waiting for a moment to pounce. My phone lit up late one night, a photo from my mother-in-law. The image showed my unseen daughter, barely 3 years old, standing at the window with that innocent, quizzical gaze, while the backyard glowed with an unsettling, almost unnatural light. I felt my insides twist when I noticed the reflection in the window behind her. It was my mother-in-law, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something wild, a glint that sent ice running through my veins, though I brushed it off as paranoia, convinced I was simply spiraling due to the stress of family tensions. But things only escalated. I began finding notes on my car, slipped under the windshield wipers that only read, "Time is slipping away," with no signature. Just a trembling anxiety creeping further into my soul. I told my wife about it, although I regretted the moment I saw the doubt construct a fortress around her disbelief, and she suggested I was overstressed, living in a fog of paranoia, but I knew better. Something was horribly wrong, and it seemed to mirror the late arrivals of my in-laws. One rainy evening as I returned from work, I noticed them standing in their driveway, drenched, appearing almost ghostly in the dim light, and when they finally approached, they had that same eerie look. They claimed to have just arrived back from a trip, yet this wasn't a regular visit. My skin prickled with dread as I processed that the clothes they wore didn't match weather conditions, nor did they carry any luggage. They insisted on spending time with my daughter, and despite my instincts screaming at me to protect her, my wife played along, and I could only hang back, unease coiling like a serpent in my gut as they led her into the dark house, a cavernous maw waiting to swallow innocent laughter. Things went completely dark when my daughter didn't return for hours, and I rushed around, pacing, calling her name before I banged down my in-laws' door, only to find them sitting there, hazy, eyes shimmering as they told me they were just having fun. Yet my little girl's absence felt like an eternity, and each second stretched into endless possibilities, a knot twisted unyieldingly at my core. Panic welled inside me, erupting into visceral desperation as I tore through their house, the fading scent of something metallic pulling me further into the nightmare unfolding within each stagnant room as I began seeing bizarre photographs plastered on the walls, pictures of children playing but with disturbing overtones of something nefarious, like their laughter was forcibly infused into each snapshot, faces twisted into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I finally found my daughter, sitting eerily still in a dim-lit kitchen, her eyes glazed over, staring blankly into space, as if something had siphoned the brightness from her soul. When I reached for her, a voice, low and viscous, crawled through the air, laced with ethereal confidence that suggested they had been waiting for me all along. "You have to let her stay, she's ours now." With a primal scream, I ripped my daughter from the table, sprinting out of the house while a collective whisper cascaded behind me, sharpness in the air, promising I had only buried the truth of their generational curse deeper beneath a facade of civility. I bolted down the street, holding my child tightly as the relentless echoes of their laughter melded into a cacophony of threat behind me. Now, every time I hear the doorbell ring or see their silhouettes hovering in the corner of my eye, I am reminded that I can't escape the haunting truth. It's all interconnected, the waiting, the late arrivals, the suffocating silence betraying a sinister undercurrent that knows our fears and plays with them like a puppet master, realizing now that my choice to demand punctuality had awakened something within them that shouldn't have been stirred, and perhaps I sealed our fate when I thought I was just standing my ground. I wasn't planning on going to my family's Thanksgiving dinner this year. I had been avoiding my relatives since that summer when my cousin Jake had found the old family recipe book in my grandmother's attic, the one marked with an odd symbol on the cover, like a twisted vine, which he insisted we use for the pumpkin pie, but I shrugged him off, dismissing any thoughts of using something that felt so out of place in a holiday tradition. Still, after weeks of nagging from my mother, I reluctantly agreed to attend, convinced that it would simply be a classic fight over politics and the same old complaints about how I was still single in my mid-20s. Yet, as the last rays of autumn sunlight dipped below the horizon and I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, a strange feeling twisted in my stomach, an instinct warning me that something was lurking just beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family gathering. I walked into the house, smelling the familiar aromas of roast turkey and stuffing, which should have felt comforting but instead only heightened my unease, every chuckle shared over the table echoing like an uninvited specter mocking me. When dessert was announced, I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back as Jake was called upon to serve the pumpkin pie he had so wickedly insisted on preparing. I watched him slice it, the knife sliding through it like it was soft butter, revealing an unusual number of seeds embedded within, but no one else seemed bothered by it as they dove eagerly into their helpings, laughter fading to a low murmur as I glanced around the table, noticing Jake getting more animated as he spoke about this special pie, whispering how the recipe had been passed down for generations, but the glee in his voice had an unsettling edge I couldn't quite place. I felt compelled to try it, despite the gnawing voice in my head screaming for me to stop, so I reluctantly took a slice, the flavor exploding in my mouth, sweet yet somehow earthy, its richness unsettling yet addictive. As I swallowed, a dangerous lump formed in my throat, a panic rising when I caught Jake watching me, a smirk crossing his lips that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. The room felt claustrophobic, laughter morphing into distant chatter as I tried to maintain a smile, feeling the heaviness of the pie settle in my stomach like an anchor, each passing moment dragging me deeper into a pit of dread until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood abruptly, the sound of my chair scraping against the wooden floor tearing through the haze of conversation, and declared I was leaving, my heart racing as Jake's smile seemed to widen impossibly, genuine concern now masking a flicker of something darker. As I hurried out, I could hear my family's confused voices behind me, but all I could think was that I needed to get away from the house, the laughter that once filled it now sounding like derisive whispers in my ears. Storming out into the cool air, I felt both dizzy and wired, plunging into my car and slamming the door, my eyes darting back at the house lit up like a misplaced island of warmth in the dark, a beacon that now felt utterly sinister. It was only when I pulled out of the driveway that I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw Jake standing on the porch with a wide, sickening grin, the odd symbol from the recipe book now burned into my memory, and with every passing moment, the twisted reality began to settle in. What had he really put in that pie? I drove for what felt like hours, heart racing and mind racing faster, the thought of venturing back home making my stomach churn anew, but something inside told me to drive somewhere safe, somewhere normal. After pulling into the nearest gas station, I stumbled inside, seeking solace in the flickering fluorescent lights, but as I approached the cashier, my heart sank when I saw the subtle, knowing smirk on the cashier's face, his fingers idly tapping rhythmically on the counter almost like a signal, and everything that had felt odd lately crashed down on me, the feeling of familiarity, of dread, consuming me whole the second that cashier leaned forward and whispered, low and conspiratorial, "You shouldn't have left, the seed will find its way back to you." I bolted from the station, frantically spitting the words, "What did you mean?" into the window, but only the howling wind answered back, beckoning me home as the road stretched before me like a sinister path. When I finally returned home, the house loomed larger than before, shadows creeping across the porch like fingers grasping for the night. My family's laughter echoed again, but this time it felt warped, a cacophony of invasive whispers, relentlessly urging me to step inside. I pushed through the door and stepped into the dining room, where the remnants of our abandoned dinner remained. The pumpkin pie sat at the center, untouched and glistening in the dying light, looking more like a trophy than a dessert, and my family greeted me with smiles that felt jagged and twisted, eyes glinting as if they were anticipating something I was all too terrified to comprehend. There, at the head of the table, Jake's expression was almost a riddle, a puzzle formed of sinister delight, when he beckoned me forward, commanding me to take a seat, but every instinct within me screamed to run away. I could feel tendrils of darkness wrapping around my limbs, slowly pulling me down into the chair like glue, insistent, as the pie appeared to glare at me, glare with seated familiarity that echoed the night of shadows that still loomed over the house. The last thing I saw before everything spiraled into an unending void was Jake lifting the knife, that same wicked grin plastered across his face as he prepared to serve another slice, my scream of an unrecognizable foreboding cutting through the atmosphere, but dread pooled in my stomach as I knew, at that moment, the seed had begun to grow. I hesitated before hitting the send button, my phone trembling in my sweaty palm as I stared at the message I wrote to my aunt, the woman who had been the thorn in my side for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of relative who offered unsolicited advice and criticized every aspect of my life, from my choice of career to my wardrobe, but when she insisted on coming to my house for my birthday dinner, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It was supposed to be a day for celebration, a day to enjoy with my friends and family, and instead, the evening turned into a twisted family therapy session where I was dissected like a frog in biology class, her sharp tongue skewering my self-esteem. After an hour of her cutting remarks, I snapped, my patience evaporating like water on a hot day, and I blurted out, "I'll never be good enough for you, will I?" All her laughter and condescension stopped, replaced with an icy silence, and for a moment, I reveled in the satisfaction that came from bringing her down a peg. However, that satisfaction was fleeting and morphed into a sick dread when her expression shifted into something unreadable, as if she had just discovered a hidden truth that had lain dormant for years. The silence stretched heavily between us, wrapping the entire room in a smothering shroud, and when my best friend, Mark, attempted to lighten the mood with a joke, laughter just seemed to echo awkwardly around the table, hardly concealing the tension. My aunt finally spoke, her voice low and slow, like molasses oozing out of a jar. "You should really go to your room, dear," she said, and I let out a nervous laugh, thinking she was joking, but her eyes glinted with a mixture of anger and something else that sent a shiver down my spine. I could practically feel the echoes of my words hanging in the air, thick and cloying, as I excused myself and retreated to my room, the walls creeping closer as if they were eavesdropping. It was hours before I heard the sounds of the dinner party winding down, loud chatter interspersed with laughter from Mark that felt far away, an island of normalcy in a sea of dread, but even the laughter couldn't drown out the gnawing in my gut that told me I had crossed a line. When the door creaked open, it was my mother standing there, her face pale. "Your aunt wants to talk to you," she said quietly, and I could see the worry etched on her features. I moved reluctantly, every step weighed down with foreboding until I stepped into the living room, where my aunt sat stiffly on the edge of the couch as if she were so wound up that she might snap. I could feel my heart race, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay, my eyes glued to her, and then she leaned forward, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for our family, do you?" I opened my mouth to protest, to ground her words in some semblance of reality, but I was struck dumb by the raw intensity in her gaze. It was as if she were peering into my soul, dissecting all my hidden insecurities, and in a volcanic eruption of emotions that I couldn't control, she admitted something I never saw coming. Her upbringing had been a nightmare. The house was filled with whispers and shadows of unspoken things, and I had been too naive to notice. For what felt like hours, she unraveled the threads of her own pain, stories of family betrayals and lost loves, everything meeting the gnashing of teeth and the silent screams of the night. I wanted to comfort her, but the more she spoke, the more disoriented I became, ideas of comfort clashing with the venomous way she treated me, and in this warped tapestry of her life, I saw reflection, not just of herself, but a reflection of how she viewed me, as a failure with no hope in her eyes. When she finally fell silent, I stood frozen, the weight of this revelation heavy on my chest as I struggled to find the words to fill the void that had opened between us. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but there was something fractured in her expression. She gazed at me with an intensity I couldn't fathom, and just below the surface, I sensed her disappointment, a flicker of pain that ignited into a wildfire. She leaned closer, seemingly brimming with a need to impart her final lesson. "You must understand, it's not about being good enough, it's about survival. Life is unforgiving, and if you can't understand that, then you have no hope." At that moment, I felt a shiver ripple across my spine. It felt like a threat wrapped in wisdom, a chilling portent of what awaited me beyond the confines of this moment. My pulse quickened, and as I stumbled backward, I could feel that same creeping sensation that had haunted me since I was a child. I turned and fled upstairs, shutting the door behind me, pushing my back against it as if barricading myself against her presence. But the moment I felt safe, the shadows in my room shifted, flickering like candlelight, and I whimpered at the encroaching darkness. It wasn't until later, curled under my soft blanket, that I heard the muffled echoes of conversation between my mother and my aunt downstairs, their voices entwined like two serpents fighting for dominance, until I finally embarked on the road to sleep, where night after night, my dreams morphed into nightmares, my aunt's words haunting me like a sinister refrain, repeating over and over until they carved grooves into my mind, sometimes morphing her face into something monstrous that loomed over me. Days bled into weeks, and while my aunt eventually left, the tension never quite dissipated. I found myself looking over my shoulder as if at any moment her icy presence would return to taunt me, the weight of our conversation still thick and oppressive, suffocating the air around me. And then the dreams grew darker, twisting into something grotesque, her voice echoing with the laughter of children, mocking me while I went untouched, trapped in a glass box that no one else could see. And during those nights, I found myself screaming for my mom, reaching for the warmth of the real world, but she couldn't hear me. I started to notice subtle shifts too, small things like objects moving in my periphery, shadows stretching in ways that defied reason, and an uneasiness burrowing itself in my bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. That sense of dread culminated on a particularly stormy night when a crack of thunder shook my room awake and I looked up to see someone standing in the shadows, the silhouette barely detectable in the darkness. But just as I was about to convince myself it was a trick of the light, I recognized the warm outline of my aunt. Her expression twisted into something terrible, smiling cruelly, a manifestation of my own fears given flesh, and in that instant, I finally understood the words she'd said. They weren't merely warnings or lessons, they were a curse set to ensnare my soul. I bolted up from my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, frantically scrambling for the light switch that ultimately betrayed me by turning on with an unsettling flicker. Yet there was no sign of her. The room was empty but still suffused with that same malignant energy, and I collapsed onto my bed in a heap of raw nerves, unable to process what I'd just experienced. Over the next few weeks, my mental state unraveled. I found myself questioning reality, my own perceptions morphing into a living nightmare, and as the sun filtered through my window, scattering light across my face, it felt like every shadow carried a dagger aimed straight at my heart, until one night, as desperation clawed violently at the edges of my mind, I confronted my mother, voice trembling. I expressed my fears, told her what I had seen, but her face mirrored only disbelief, and that made it worse. She didn't understand. She thought I was merely acting out, a child unwilling to accept the terms of adulthood. It felt as though my words floated into a void, unheard and uncared for, and that's when I realized I had no one to turn to. Weeks became months, my studies suffered, friendships strained, and the isolation consumed me, until one evening when I finally broke down, throwing a glass against the wall, the shards littering my room like fragments of my crumbling sanity. I wished I had been kinder to my aunt, wished I hadn't shouted at her, but wishful thinking morphed into deafening silence as I stood amidst the wreckage, trying to fathom my spiraling demise. Then it hit me, a radical thought that filled me with dread and clarity all at once. What if her curse was digging its claws deeper and deeper with each passing day? My mind was a battlefield of frantic thoughts. Maybe she was right all along. I was destined to be a failure. I could feel it in every shaky breath, every restless night, and one desperate line of hope strung tight in my heart. I needed to confront her, unleash whatever darkness she had thrust upon me. So, without thinking, I dialed her number, each ring like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning, and when she picked up, that familiar sing-song voice filled the air. "Hello, dear." I could hear the sweet undercurrent of condescension wrapping itself around her words, and I steeled myself, daring to confront my fears. "What did you do to me?" I managed to choke out, the words tumbling raw and unhinged, but there was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought I had lost her, and then she laughed, a chilling sound that echoed down my spine like icy fingers tracing my vertebrae. "Oh honey, that was just the beginning," she said, and I realized, right then, what terrible sacrifice she had made. No, not for the family, but to ensure that I would carry the burden of her darkness, a parasite feeding off my mistakes. With every accusation I hurled at her now, I felt smaller, more defeated. She fed off my fear, reshaping it into something twisted and wholly her own, until finally, with one last mocking laugh, she hung up, leaving me holding a phone in a vice grip as silence enveloped me, and just as the last flicker of hope threatened to evaporate, I realized something. I wasn't the one who had been cast aside, but I would be the one who would have to break the cycle, and with that ephemeral thought, everything narrowed into sharp focus. Bursts of determination surging through my veins. She could no longer control me, and while the haunting laughter lingered, a defiant fire ignited in my stomach. Just like the day I stood up for myself with words that chafed but were necessary, I would unravel her grip, confront every shadow, and refuse to be her puppet anymore. AITA for what I said to my aunt? Yes, perhaps. But what I'll do next, how I choose to take ownership of my life from here on out? That's the real question, isn't it? It's time to rise from the ashes she left behind. I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, AITA for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. When my cousin Morgan invited me to her graduation party, I was excited but also apprehensive. She had always been the golden child, and I never really measured up, so when I discovered through a mutual friend that she'd actually paid her way through an online diploma mill, a secret she vehemently tried to keep under wraps, I felt compelled to confront her in a way I never had before. As I arrived at the lavishly decorated backyard where Instagram-ready balloons floated like pastel clouds and a makeshift wooden stage awaited the valedictorian speech, I saw Morgan basking in the glow of attention, glamorous in her cap and gown, but something about her smile felt rehearsed, a facade that cracked when I caught her in a whispered conversation with her mother, her eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the dread that shadowed her achievement. The tension spiraled as I witnessed her proudly accepting faux accolades from family members who knew nothing about the truth, their hearts too eager to embrace the lie she had spun, and despite my reservations, I found myself standing closer than I should have, caught in a tide of bitter resentment and the sinking realization that the very fabric of our familial love was woven by deception. When the moment arrived, and the spotlight danced its way to me, I felt a surge of jealousy threaten to overthrow my sanity as I grasped the microphone, and almost involuntarily, I blurted out, "Congratulations, Morgan. But I guess it's not my fault you bought your degree." The gasps were audible, a sharp intake of air that split the warm afternoon like thunder, and Morgan's expression shifted instantly from shock to rage, the kind that transformed her cherubic face into a monstrous reflection of pure betrayal. Struggling to maintain my composure under the onslaught of disdainful glares from shocked relatives, I felt a rush of adrenaline, knowing I had thrown a match into a sea of dry kindling. It was a chaotic flurry of shouting voices and clattering utensils, her mother gasping as if I had slapped her across the face. Morgan lunged at me, fists flying, but I didn't back down. My voice echoed like a battle cry as I shouted back about the years spent on her high horse while I worked hard for every scrap of recognition I ever got. The guests' faces were a grim collage of disappointment and concern as Morgan choked back tears and accused me of ruining her day, insisting that our family's blood and humor had always been worth celebrating, but I stood firm in my accusation, questioning the very essence of her achievement, a hyena's laugh punctuating the tension as I pointed to her stack of ceremony photos where every smile seemed to mock the truth, and in that moment, her mask slipped away entirely, revealing the dread underneath. The argument devolved into an exhibition of dirty laundry dragged through the sunshine, where her past transgressions and insecurities collided with my burdens, creating an intangible fissure between us that I feared could never be mended, all eyes piercing through me with an intensity I had never felt before, until suddenly, an older relative stepped in, an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, who claimed to know everything, or at least our family folklore, and in that uncanny silence that followed his boisterous entry, I realized I wasn't alone in feeling weighed down by each lie we had ever entertained. It seemed there were whispers buried beneath the layers of our gatherings, and somehow I had exposed an unseen reality that shook the very roots of our idyllic narratives, and as the evening devolved into something grotesque, I felt the atmosphere shift as Morgan's confidence withered, beaten down by the harsh glare of scrutiny while our relatives circled her like vultures, waiting for her to admit her mistake amidst the chaos I had ignited. Days melted into nights, turning that party into a cursed memory, an echo reverberating in my mind where guilt twisted with vindication. I became the antagonist in my family's story, labeled as the villain who dared to expose the truth in the face of a flawless facade, while Morgan slipped deeper into denial, swaddled by the lies she had built her life upon until her phone began buzzing like a hornet's nest. Yet the only messages I received were warnings from friends out of fear of family repercussions for having spoken my mind. A week later, I awoke to a world shimmering with silence. The calls from my family had ceased, the chatter turned hollow, and every gathering near my doorstep became a reminder of the rift I had created, until Morgan's mother called me with that threatening tone, implying that I had pulled the curtain on a family scandal too sinister to ignore and told me that if I valued our relationship at all, I would confess and apologize, but I staunchly held my ground, knowing deep down our world was riddled with secrets worth preserving. But as tension morphed into shadows, something shifted in the air. Whispers followed me through the streets as contact became a dangerous commodity among family, where every encounter felt like a trial for my transgressions, and one particularly lonely night, as I sat on my porch nursing regrets, Morgan appeared without warning, her eyes clouded with uncertainty but her resolve sparked like wildfire. The once inseparable bond now lay ruptured, festering wounds of jealousy and betrayal threatening to drown any flicker of hope. She confessed that she had lived in fear, unable to tell anyone the truth about how she felt trapped in the mirage of success she had crafted, the facade becoming a noose as constricting as the expectations her mother thrust upon her. I watched her as she broke down, everything she personified crumbling into a cascade of tears. I thought this vulnerability might grant us the catharsis needed, but instead, the revelation left a bitter taste that thickened the already toxic atmosphere. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere thickened with dread, but I could not shake the feeling that I had unleashed something dark and vast into our lives. But it wasn't until Morgan threatened to seek her truth among strangers and let the world see what lay beneath our collective skin, that I understood how fragile our positions were. Each word we exchanged now felt like blades sharp enough to cleave the very fabric of our belonging, and I wondered if I had become the architect of my own isolation, torn between the vindication of honesty and the warmth of denial that had wrapped us like a cocoon for too long. When the day finally dawned, bright yet oppressive, I found myself spiraling, the daylight harsh against my regret as Morgan prepared to reveal all on social media. My heart pounded like a war drum, my vision tunneled in on the inevitable pain, but when she finally pressed send, I was left gasping in shock as the floodgates opened. Those who had smiled at her celebration turned into virtual haters, cloaked in anonymity yet wielding their venom-like knives as they punctured her facade, leaving Morgan in the ruins of her own making, shattered pieces drifting away as their words became anchors that dragged her deeper into despair. In the aftermath, as relatives distanced themselves and the truth morphed into its own gelatinous monster, I wondered whether I had been right all along or merely too cowardly to save us from the inevitable. And as Morgan sat in a self-constructed prison of hate and sorrow, I learned through the lens of my own brokenness that sometimes, saying the hard truth reveals scars too deep to heal, leaving behind a silence that echoes louder than any shout of victory could ever hope to drown. I never thought that helping my family would lead me down such a dark path, but here we are. The sun hung low when my niece Sarah showed up at my door last fall, tears streaming down her face, her voice faltering as she explained how she'd fought with her parents and was scared to go home. Without thinking twice, I opened my apartment to her, thinking her stay would be temporary, just a couple of nights before she returned to her parents, but as days turned into weeks, her desperation seemed to morph into something much darker. At first, I tried to be the support she needed. I offered her meals, a cozy bed, and even advised her about school and her budding interests, but after a while, I noticed unsettling changes. What started as a sweet, albeit troubled girl began to warp before my eyes. She would sit in the corner of the living room for hours, whispering to herself, her eyes filled with a hollow, manic light, and when I would ask her about it, she'd brush it off, claiming she was just figuring things out or working through her emotions, dealing with the stress of family conflict. But there were nights when I'd wake to the sound of her voice echoing in the hallway, practicing words I couldn't decipher, and once, I dared myself to peek through a crack in her bedroom door. I wouldn't have believed my own eyes if I hadn't seen it. She was surrounded by a circle of candles and strange drawings that looked all too similar to symbols I'd seen in horror documentaries. With an unnerving conviction, she scribbled furiously in a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. As the weeks dragged on, I felt the walls of my apartment closing in, the air thick with an urgency I couldn't explain, and then came the night that broke me. It was late, and I'd finally drifted off, haunted by the whispers from earlier, when a loud crash jolted me awake. My heart raced as I rushed to find Sarah standing in her room, her eyes wild, revealing a tangle of anger and fear. "I told you to leave me alone." She screamed at me like I'd committed the worst sin. Confused, I tried to calm her, but she just pointed to a stained piece of paper on her bed, filled with alarming incantations that made my skin crawl. I recoiled, instinctively backing away, and just as I did, her demeanor shifted, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. It wasn't my sweet niece anymore. It felt like I was looking into the eyes of someone else entirely, someone who had slipped into darkness I couldn't fathom. "You're trying to take me from it, aren't you?" she hissed, her voice twisted and guttural, and as dread washed over me, I realized that this wasn't about family disputes anymore. That night, I made a choice. I couldn't stay in my place anymore. Fears wrapped around my consciousness like vines tightening around a helpless tree, and in that moment, I felt more like the intruder than she did, a stranger in my own home. Instead of kicking her out that night, I made excuses, offered profound apologies, saying I needed space, a moment of understanding, but it was just me buying time for what I knew was an inevitable confrontation. The next day, I packed my things, reciting mantras in my mind about protecting myself, trying to shake off the layers of fear that clung to me like cobwebs. By the time dusk settled, I could no longer ignore the prickling sense of danger curling in my gut. With shaky hands, I decided to confront Sarah one last time. I found her melty from the day's heat in the living room, her eyes glossing over as she played with the remnants of what I had once thought was her childlike enthusiasm. "I need you to go home, Sarah," I said, every syllable tasting bitter as it left my lips. Panic bloomed in her gaze. It was a telltale sign of the looming storm. "You don't get to decide, Uncle," she spat, her tone turning venomous as she crept closer, lips twisted into a mirthless smile. "You're not my family anymore." It was at that precise moment that I saw that awful drawing again, harmlessly placed at my feet, and I panicked, the reality of the situation crashing down like thunderous waves on a fragile shore. The words tumbled out before I could take them back. "Get out." The words echoed in the corners of the room, reverberating off the walls like I'd broken a silence that should have remained sacred. She went still, a predator's intensity falling across her features as she started to smile, a grin that pushed the boundaries of human emotion as she took one deliberate step towards me. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I turned on my heel, stumbling toward the door, quick as a shadow, and in my flight, I could hear her laughter, frighteningly joyful, echoing in the hallways as I fled my own home. I did what I thought was necessary, forcing me to question the walls that once sheltered me. Was I right to kick her out when she needed help? Or did my actions unleash something far worse, something dark, as I fled from the very bond of family meant to shelter and protect? I stayed with a friend that night, but the reality settled on my chest like a lead weight. I could hear her whispers ringing in my ears, and I couldn't help but wonder if Sarah had truly been lost to darkness or if it was me who had cast her into those depths by abandoning her in her moment of need. Now, every time I close my eyes, I hear her chilling laughter and wonder, am I safe, or did I just make a deal with something I can't comprehend? I never thought a simple act of love would spiral into a nightmare, but here I am, trapped in a dark web of regret and horror. It all began when my daughter, Claire, who had been a vibrant light in my life, introduced me to her partner, Mia, and their gorgeous twin daughters, Lily and Rose. They were the kind of girls who left trails of glitter and laughter wherever they went, but with their busy lives and my own responsibilities, I felt that a handmade gesture would reconnect us all. So, I spent weeks sewing two cozy, colorful quilts adorned with intricate patterns of flowers and butterflies, one for each girl. The day I presented them, the delight in their eyes made every cut and stitch worth it, and at that moment, I basked in their joy, never knowing the darkness that lay ahead. It wasn't long after that, on a seemingly ordinary weekend, that strange things began to happen. It started when Lily fell ill with what Claire insisted was a common cold, but the next day, Rose also came down with the same symptoms. Then, a week later, Claire reached out to me in a panic. The girls had developed strange rashes on their arms and legs that seemed to flare up after curling up under the very quilts I had made. I felt a prick of unease, but I dismissed it, thinking it must have been an adverse reaction to the fabric I had used. They'll be fine, I reassured her, though my heart was pounding as I hung up the phone. Then, more disturbing occurrences began to pile up. The family's cat, a fluffy tabby named Muffin, went missing, and one night I distinctly heard hushed voices coming from the girls' room. Concerned, I knocked, and Claire opened the door just enough to peek through, her face as pale as the moonlight illuminating the hallway. I could see the girls huddled under the blankets, whispering, but not talking to anyone as I recognized, perhaps playing some innocent game. Yet their giggles seemed unnaturally high-pitched and echoed unsettlingly in my ears. I brushed it off as growing pains of parenthood and carried on, crafting more quilts to send their way in a futile attempt to brush the darkness away. That wrong turn led me down a path of disbelief when one evening, as I looked through my sewing supplies, I stumbled upon something horrifying, tiny strips of fabric that looked almost like hair. Horrified, I collapsed into a parent's worst nightmare. The girls weren't just playing, they were weaving something darker than I could fathom. I found myself waking up in cold sweats, the images of my beloved grandchildren flickering in flame-like visions, the sound of their laughter turning into shrill screams. Barely sleeping, I found myself almost instinctively checking in on them more often, but each visit felt more shadowy than the last. One Friday night, driven by an unfathomable pull, I decided to follow those haunting whispers. It led me to the door of their room once more, but this time something shifted in me. Instead of fear, a deep curiosity consumed me. Peeking through the crack made my breath hitch. The girls were seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles illuminating a strange symbol drawn in chalk. Before them lay the quilts, their colors appearing almost too vibrant, too alive, and they were using them as an altar of sorts. I opened the door wider, my heart hammering, to find the girls chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend, their innocent faces now twisted into something unsettling, eyes too old for their little bodies, gleaming with a hunger I had never seen before. They turned to me in unison and smiled, revealing teeth that glinted unnaturally in the candlelight. "Join us, Grandma." They chimed, voices thick with something unnameable. I didn't know what to do. Every maternal instinct screamed for me to pull them away from whatever malevolence they were dabbling in. Yet another part of me, perhaps the deeper, darker part, was both terrified and fascinated. I backed away, closing the door quietly, wanting to give them space while also terrified for their safety. I tried calling Claire, but my hands shook too violently to dial correctly as dread choked me. The following week spiraled out of control. The more I tried to distance myself from the girls, the more the dark energy seemed to repulse me. It became evident to me that their rashes had worsened, and I saw a subtle change in Claire too: tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes, a sense of fatigue that aged her rapidly. When I finally managed to pry it from her lips, Claire admitted the girls had started talking about the night of offerings and other strange rituals, things that had no place in a child's imagination, and I felt faint. Panic surged through my veins. I needed to act before it spiraled completely out of control, but every time I tried to confront Mia and Claire, they brushed it off as just childhood imagination. But as their grandmother, I couldn't shake that feeling. I snuck around their house one night while they were out, trying to gather anything unusual. In the attic, buried beneath old toys, I found a tattered book filled with illustrations of symbols and relentless incantations. I flipped through it, confusion giving way to horror as the truth struck me: a dark lineage, a twisted legacy that my family seemed to have avoided, but now threatened to awaken with my innocent gestures of love. I ripped the book shut and stumbled out of the house, barely breathing, feeling the weight of my actions suffocate me. The quilting I thought would bind our family together was pulling me into something far more sinister. A choice had to be made. I began to cut ties, slowly withdrawing from their lives, desperate to protect my own sanity, but the girls grew more insistent, more invasive, as if sensing my fear and reluctance. At a family gathering later, I watched them closely. Something shifted in me when Rose smiled at me, a smile that seemed almost predatory. I felt as though she knew the truth of my cowardice. When I could take it no longer, I gathered everyone and blurted out all I had found, all that I had deciphered from the tattered book. Instead of disbelief, their laughter filled the air again, but it felt different, sharp and menacing. "It's not a game, Grandma," they said in unison, voices layered with something vile that chilled my very spirit. It was too late, I couldn't escape this. As Claire and Mia exchanged glances filled with acknowledgement, my heart sank. "You made a mistake," Claire said, and I felt my pulse quicken. I thought about the blankets, the love I had poured into those quilts, and it hit me: the offerings they spoke of were not mere children's games, and now I knew I was not just the innocent grandmother in this twisted tale. I had woven my own entrapment with every stitch and thread. I looked into the girls' eyes, shivers racing down my spine, realizing that they had drawn me into their machinations far deeper than I dared to believe, and it was there, nestled inside those blankets, where the true monstrosity lay waiting for the moment they decided to claim it. "So," I ask again, "AITA for making my lesbian daughter's children blankets?" Last Saturday, while the sun cast its late afternoon glow over our modest home, I received a message that would unravel everything I thought was stable in my marriage. It was from Melanie, my husband's ex-wife, and it said she needed a place to crash for a while. My fingers twitched over my phone as I hesitated, recalling the awkward dinners where I plastered a smile on my face while she recounted tales of their life together, stories punctuated with nostalgia that felt like knives twisting in my gut. I caught a glimpse of my husband, Mark, with his dreams of being a father, and I remembered how her shadow loomed over our plans, how he'd sometimes get lost in thoughts of what might have been. I took a deep breath, recalling the bite of jealousy that came with every shared memory, that smirk she wore like a crown, reminding me of her former reign over his heart. I tapped on the screen. Whipped it if I told her to find another place? Just as I was about to hit send, I caught sight of Mark returning from the backyard, his hands muddy and a smile on his face, remnants of our future buried just under the surface. There was no response from the group chat, just an empty void of digital uncertainty that gnawed at me. What if they were right? What if I was the villain in this tale? As the day slipped into night, the shadows stretched, morphing and contorting into familiar shapes, weaving my mind into a frenzy of fear and anxiety. I envisioned what my decision could unleash, the ripples echoing into our lives, a thin thread snapping, leaving chaos in its wake. Mark and I sat down to dinner, his friendliness unsettling, and I found myself eating in silence, the tension growing like vines choking a tree. Did he suspect the turmoil I wove inside? My stomach churned at the thought of blurting out my plan. Afterward, as he settled into bed and the house grew quiet, I lay awake, considering every angle until I finally managed to sleep, only to be jarred awake by a crashing noise. My heart raced. I stumbled into the hallway, guided by faint whispers that danced around me. As I approached Mark's study, I saw the door ajar, and the voice that floated through sent chills down my spine. It was Melanie, hushed and conspiratorial, sweet with promises that felt laced with malevolence. I couldn't hear all the words, but the laughter set my blood on fire, and at that moment, the weight of my indecision crystallized into resolve. I would tell her to leave. That night, sleep evaded me as I envisioned the conversation brewing like a storm in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, as Mark sipped his coffee, the sun waking up through the kitchen window, I finally mustered the courage, my blood pounding in my ears. "We need to talk about Melanie," I said, my voice steady but betraying a tremor that he noticed immediately. Mark's eyes narrowed as he pushed the mug away. That was my sign. He listened as I poured out my feelings, how her presence hung over us like a specter, how it embarrassed me, how it twisted the knife deeper every time she smiled at him with that same infuriating warmth. "She needs to find her own place," I concluded, my heart racing in my chest as his expression darkened. Silence enveloped the room, thick and suffocating, a pulse of tension twisting like a living thing. "You don't understand how needful her situation is," he countered, his voice soft but full of brooding sadness, leaving me bewildered. How could he still defend her? My heart sank deeper as he went on about her struggles, the difficult life she had because of our divorce, and the children who lived scattered in the wake of their split. Every word he uttered felt like a sharp blade carving deeper into my resolve. I could feel tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I choked back the helplessness clawing at my throat. But as I stared into his eyes, still sparkling with affection, I realized I couldn't let them reignite the embers of their past. The weeks dragged on, the moments we once cherished were tainted by her lingering presence. I could see it in Mark's furtive glances at his phone, the way he wore an anxious smile whenever her name popped up on the screen. It was then I decided that fear alone wouldn't determine my happiness or his instincts. It had to be gone. Our home became a battlefield of unspoken words and invisible corpses, each day a test of my will. I found myself drawn back to the messages, the ones that had painted her darker than before, a sly predator in sheep's clothing. I reached out to friends who had been sympathetic, listening intently while my confidence solidified. They told me what I had known all along. I deserved a life free from haunting pasts, a love untainted by the ghosts of former partners. It was finally time for confrontation. I had nudged the gears forward and couldn't pull back from the momentum charging through my veins. One afternoon, in the midst of kitchen chaos, I called her. My heart raced as the call connected. Her hesitant voice on the other end was a siren's call that needed shattering. "Melanie, we need to talk," I said, every word dripping with resolve, and through the exchanges, I felt the power shift in my grip. She danced around the subject, veering expertly, but I remained anchored, bringing the topic back to her stay. "Mark and I love each other, and you can't keep crashing here," I said, feeling the tremor of adrenaline coursing through my bloodstream. To my surprise, she laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. "You think this is over?" She spoke, silky and twisted. "This isn't your movie, and I'm not going anywhere." I remember that gut-sinking moment when I realized this wasn't merely about space, it was a tug-of-war for dominance. That night, I tried to shake the fear that clenched onto my gut like a vice. I envisioned slamming the door in her face, but it was Mark's words that simmered in my ears. "She's my past," he had told me, like a scar on my soul that can't simply fade. It plagued me every second until the reality set in. I had to act. Just as the sun sank low the following evening, Melanie walked in unannounced. She saw my fury and shrugged like a doll with missing strings. "Can I stay for just one more night?" she crooned, her face plastered with that same smirk that sent nausea churning in my belly. I snapped, my body fueled by primal rage. This was mine, our home. "No. You're done. You've overstayed your welcome," I shouted, my voice breaking the silence with unexpected ferocity. The calmness in her eyes vanished. For a moment, I saw something sinister flash across her face, a sharp edge, a tempest beneath the surface. "You better tread carefully, darling," she hissed, and for an instant, her hand slipped into her pocket, but I stood firm, unwavering. The tension crackled like energy in the air, enveloping us in a precarious standoff. "Get out," I repeated, cold and distant. She regarded me for a moment longer before a slow smile unfurled on her lips that set every hair on my body on edge, the kind of smile that hinted at a deeper madness, a buried threat that rose and fell with every heartbeat. "This isn't over, you know," she said, every word syrupy sweet until she finally turned to leave, and the door slammed shut with an echoing finality. I thought I had won, but as the days turned into weeks, I discovered the true cost of that victory. It wasn't until late one night, sleep evading me again, that I heard the rustling outside our window, so familiar, so haunting. I peered through the blinds, only to find her silhouette lurking across the street, her eyes alight with a dangerous glow. She stood there for hours, unmoving, and in that moment, I felt the walls of my mind closing in. It was then that I realized I hadn't simply pushed her away, I had unleashed a storm far beyond my control. Since that night, my thoughts have been increasingly fractured. Each creak in the house sends my heart racing. I see her lingering everywhere, the grocery store, the park when Mark takes our dog for a walk, even the dinner parties where friends mention her name. I can't shake the feeling that she's watching me, just waiting for the right moment to slip back into our lives like the darkness seeping through the cracks. I wish I could say that I felt free, that I had finally paved a path to happiness, but each day feels like a puzzle piece snapping into place, fraying along the edges. Was I the villain? Did I open a door I was never meant to? The echoes of laughter haunt me in the quiet hours, and as I look into Mark's eyes, I no longer see the warmth I once cherished, all I glimpse is uncertainty. I often wonder if I made a god-awful mistake, and I'm not sure if I can ever escape the shadows she left behind, or worse, if she will eventually come back for what she believes is hers. The claims of an ex haunt me now like whispers in the dark, and for the first time since we said, I do, I fear I might lose him to her still. I never thought I would reach a point where I had to make a post like this, but here I am, desperate for validation on whether I'm the asshole in this twisted situation. It all started last spring when my brother, Mark, began showing up unannounced at my apartment. At first, I thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd drop in with some lame excuse about needing to borrow a tool or ask for advice on his car, but as weeks passed, his visits morphed from casual to obsessive. It wasn't long before I noticed things started to feel off. He'd expertly manipulate the conversation to shift focus to my life, probing about my job, my friendships, my love life, as if gathering data to fuel some hidden agenda. I brushed it off as sibling curiosity at first, shrugging it away until that one fateful afternoon I came home from work to find my door wide open. Panic washed over me as I rushed inside, heart racing, to find my apartment completely intact. But there, in the living room, was a note rested on my coffee table, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You need to be more open to me." It unnerved me more than I could express. Was I being paranoid? I decided to confront him, and when I did, Mark laughed it off, insisting I was reading too much into it. But I was no longer comfortable with him just popping by whenever he felt like it. I needed my space. So, after much deliberation, I made the decision to change the locks. When I told him, he looked at me, the laughter draining from his face, replaced by something colder, darker. He said nothing but walked away, a shadow crossing his features. A week later, I woke up in the dead of night to the distinct sound of my door jiggling. My heart pounded as I froze in fear, listening carefully, praying it was just an old pipe or a figment of my imagination. But no, the rattling persisted for what felt like hours, and then it stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside, waiting for the right moment to breach my sanctuary. I buried myself in my blankets, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew. Mark was relentless. The next morning, I found more notes scattered around my apartment, all manner of things from "I just want to help" to "Why can't you see I'm your only family?" It was suffocating, the pervasive sense of dread that began to chase me through my days. I felt trapped in a nightmare, and the lines of love and manipulation blurred until there was nothing left but darkness. I decided to take action. I went to the police station and filed a report. They couldn't do much, just a recognized nuisance, they said. As I left, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to protect me. Every break in my routine, every sound outside my window incited pure terror. I looked for any chance to escape, weekend getaways, late-night shifts, anything to avoid the haunting presence of my brother. And then one stormy evening, with thunder rumbling and rain pouring like the sky itself was breaking apart, someone banged on my window. It was Mark, drenched and grinning in a way that set off alarm bells in my mind. "Surprise. I thought I'd come over to help you with that article you're working on." The sickening jolt of dread coursed through my veins. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I quickly mumbled something and darted to the door, locking it just as he reached for the handle. But I could see him through the peephole, my own brother. His grin widened, but his eyes were wild, icicles of twisted madness in the torrential downpour. With every thump of his fist against the door, the world outside blurred, leaving only a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I was losing my grip, feeling as if I was slipping into some alternate reality. Was I the villain for wanting space? Was it wrong to feel caged by someone who claimed to love me, or was I just pushing him away? I yelled at him to leave, realizing too late the trap I had walked into, his soft chuckle echoing unnervingly through the night. But I'm your family. We're supposed to be close. I finally lost it, my voice cracking as I screamed, aren't you supposed to care about what I want? And just like that, the laughter stopped. Mark's expression shifted, his mouth tightened as he said, you think you can change the locks on family? You can't escape me. I bolted to my bedroom, fumbling for my phone, but as I turned, I saw him standing in my living room, having somehow slipped through a window I thought I had locked. My breath caught in my throat as he said very calmly, it's not just the lock settling the score, sis. You need to learn that family always finds a way in. Then everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness, I was sprawled on the floor of my apartment with no memory of what happened next, but one thing was clear, in that moment, I truly understood what it meant to be the scapegoat in a family tied tighter than the strongest chain, each link weighed down with the burden of madness. My brother was no longer just a sibling, he had become something beyond that, something dangerous, twisted. Now, as I sit here, typing this, I can't help but wonder if I did the right thing by confronting him, changing the locks, and asking him to stay away, but the truth is, I still hear his laughter echoing through the walls, and that little voice keeps haunting me, AITA for telling my brother to stop coming unannounced. I think I might be the biggest fool for thinking I could change the locks on the chains binding us. I remember the day my friend Jay gave me the expensive clothes like it was etched into my mind, a vibrant blur of silk and stitch set against the mundane backdrop of my cluttered apartment. Jay was a fashion influencer, strutting through life like a peacock, draped in designer pieces that sparkled in the sunlight. We met in college, two misfits who bonded over weird hobbies and alternative music, and just when I thought I was past the days of scraping by, Jay surprised me with bags overflowing with items from his latest collaboration, luxury clothes that danced around their own presence with excellence. My heart swelled at the gift. I didn't just see clothes, but a ticket to a world I felt I could never belong to, a place where confidence dripped from every seam. For weeks, I wore those clothes like armor, striding through life with newfound bravado. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers complimented me, their kind words wrapping around me like a warm embrace as I reveled in the prestige those clothes brought. But as my inner circle of friends began to dwindle, whispers ran through our group. Some suggested I sell them for a quick buck, pieces like that fetched sky-high prices, they said, while others told me horror stories about friends who had borrowed expensive items and ruined them. One night, over too many cheap beers and too much bravado, I decided to post the clothes online, just to see what interest might spark, but when I woke up that morning, I felt sick at the thought. Jay had spat out warnings about the pitfalls of selling gifts, their possessions no longer, and the moment you let them go, something within you starts to wither just like that little green plant in my apartment that never thrived. The next day, Jay texted me, asking if I'd reconsider. His tone was neither accusing nor pleading, simply curious, had I really done it? I agonized, my stomach twisting like a kite caught in the wind, and the guilt clawed at me like a feral cat. I texted back, I didn't sell it, I just thought about it. His response was cool, but something flickered in the back of my mind. Was he disappointed? That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine, a low, gravelly tone that pierced through the average daytime noise. It's important you meet me, it rasped, and something deep in my gut screamed danger. I hung up, my heart racing like a train on a crooked track, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me for days. Then came the confrontation over dinner, the smells of pizza and soda fading into a background haze as Jay's voice cut through the silence. You need to sell them, you're missing the opportunity here, he urged, but there was something darker behind his eyes, the flicker of something almost predatory, and as I lifted my glass, I realized that his grip on the table trembled slightly. You don't get it. I can't take something precious and just throw it away, I reasoned, but he leaned closer, and I was struck by an icy claw of fear. They don't belong to you, he hissed, his fingers curling like talons around the remnants of his slice of pizza, and I felt that inexplicable emptiness inside me flare into something jagged and immense. Later that night as I tossed and turned, my phone buzzed like a vibrant insect in the darkness. It was Jay, asking me for a photo of the clothes, seemingly innocent, but I could feel that disturbing edge underneath, coiling tighter around my mind. Caught between paranoia and friendship, I decided to ignore it, but my reluctance spiraled into an insatiable paranoia as every knock on my door echoed through my dreams. Weeks crawled by, and out of nowhere, I began receiving mysterious messages, strangers reaching out claiming to know Jay, their words slick with venom that suggested I needed to wear those clothes again or risk facing a spiritual wrath. The clothes, I learned, bore an offense only those deep in the fashion underworld could understand. They weren't mere garments, they were trophies of popularity, each thread woven from the hopes and struggles of those who desired fame before me. What had I stumbled into? I wondered, but every time I tried to confront Jay, he sidestepped me, elusive and disquietingly charming. One evening, in an effort to reclaim control, I turned on the lights in my living room and held the clothes hostage in plain sight, confronting them like they were sentient beings with an unholy agenda. I snapped a picture, half expecting to see demons lurking around the edges of the frame. Days passed in a muffled haze, but then came the night. It was stormy, the wind howling like a pack of lost souls. I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, considering burning them rather than selling them, my heart drumming with the rhythm of fear and guilt. That's when the phone rang, eyes wide. I answered, and it was Jay again, frantic and clawing. "You want your life back. You have to wear them. If you don't, you'll never be free," he screamed through the receiver, almost incoherent. I felt tears prick at my eyes as I hung up. A tempest of panic swelled, but an insidious part of me wondered if wearing the clothes would liberate me from the shackles that had been tightening around my heart. Just that night, amid crashing thunder, I slipped into the most regal piece Jay had gifted me. Instantly, a wave of euphoria washed over, making me feel alive and powerful. The clothes wrapped around me like an embrace that transcended simple aesthetics. But as dawn approached and the light turned madly crimson, a creeping sensation clawed its way up my spine, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the old mirror. The reflection that looked back at me was distorted, twisted. It was Jay's face morphing into mine, wearing my own features in a grotesque parody. I felt the full weight of the clothes dragging me deeper into a void, and suddenly the price of acceptance became evident. The expensive threads were binding me to him. I stumbled back, ripping the clothes off as the fabric felt like razor blades against my skin, and while they landed in a heap on the floor, the moment they fell, the twisted vision vanished. Jay called for me again, begging, pleading, almost crying, and I went cold inside. I locked my door and tossed the clothes into the old furnace in my building's basement, adrenaline buzzing like a hive. Before I could feel relief, the pounding on my apartment door echoed through my mind. Jay, desperately wanting to reclaim what was his, but they weren't his anymore. "You can't throw them away. They're mine to control," he shouted, his voice breaking and unraveling into something almost pitiful. I didn't respond, just sat against the door, feeling the weight of both decisions crashing onto my shoulders. Hours crept by, and as the sun rose, I felt the tension lift as if a dark cloud had finally broken. But as I settled into that dawning tranquility, my phone buzzed with notifications, cold dread seeping back into my bones. Picture after picture poured in, Jay wearing them one by one, each snap more distorted and vengeful than the last. The final image etched a nightmare into my mind, Jay's face, grinning sickeningly as he held up a crude feedback board of my friends begging me to join them in this fashion parade, my reflection emerging from the depths of hell itself, a twisted war of dominance vibrant enough to burn the retina. At that moment, lying on my kitchen floor, I felt like I was ripped apart by threads of consequence and heartbreak. Jay wasn't just a friend anymore, he was a creature of desire, hungry for the essence that tethered me to the world I thought I understood. I was escalating into his warped image of fame, and all I could do was huddle in the corner of the room, wondering whether the price was too steep. It dawned on me then that the clothes hadn't just been a gift, they were a curse, a striking reminder that sometimes, when greed wraps its hands around your heart, it obliterates not just what you have but the familiar warmth of the person you thought you once knew. Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moment stretched on indefinitely, Aunt Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fissure. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered, for what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? "Aunt Helen, I just can't," I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. "I can't eat things that have been sitting around." "What if it's bad?" The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounded me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. "I can't," I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. "I refuse." I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained, would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us? I never thought my life would take the turn it did that fateful evening when I decided to clear out our daughter's bedroom. I stood in the doorway, heart racing, staring at the colorful walls plastered with unicorn stickers that she loved so much, a room frozen in her laughter and brightness, but now haunted by my husband's betrayal, a betrayal I had stumbled upon just weeks before, his late-night texts, his reckless disregard for our family, and the undeniable evidence of an affair that birthed a child they never intended for me to know. But I knew everything. Still, those long sleepless nights consisted of perfecting my revenge, and the twisted sense of justice motivated me to pack up her life as if I was merely returning a borrowed possession to a long-lost friend. I remembered the day she was born, how I had cradled her tiny body in my arms, promising her eternal love and protection, and suddenly, I felt this primal urge to shield her from the disgrace of her father's actions, and so that night, I made the trek to the attic and retrieved the boxes marked with her name, stuffed animals, art supplies, those crayon-drawn pictures that once adorned our fridge, items that brought joy now felt like reminders of her father's betrayal. I marched to her room, emptying shelves, packing them meticulously, as if with every toy I stuffed into the box I could erase the memories of his infidelity, feelings of rage coursing through my veins as I imagined his other child, the one from the affair, unpacking her things in my sacred space, living a life in our home where my daughter's spirit once thrived. How dare he think he could bring that child into our world as though nothing had changed? I loaded my car with the boxes that night, my heart pounding, the weight of my decision clinging to my chest. The thought of her father coming home to find nothing but stark walls staring back at him was too delicious to resist. I drove to my parents' house, a place where I had grown up, their cozy warmth suffocating me in nostalgia as I lugged in the boxes, determined to secure a part of my daughter's happiness where no one could touch it, wrapping it in the safe confines of love, and calling my parents to let them know the crazy plan I was enacting. They were concerned but ultimately supportive, especially after hearing the tremor of betrayal in my voice, the elements of sadness seeping through the cracks of my resolve. The weeks that followed were restless, amplifying my anxiety when I finally decided to confront him. His apologies rang hollow as he described how life just happened, and the words tore through me, shattered glass echoing in the vacant spaces of my heart. I could feel the cracks form as he pleaded with me to just give everything a second chance, to welcome him back into my arms and our daughter's life, an opportunity I knew I could never grant. Instead, I threw the boxes down around him, each one thudding against the floor with the weight of our broken dreams. Hexing him with my furious stare, I told him I'd already done the heavy lifting. He would have nothing left of her, nothing left of peace for the child that had stolen my life. He gasped, his face morphing into disbelief, anger bubbling within those hazel eyes I once loved, but I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I hung up the phone after declaring it was done, a calm overtaking me as I drove back to my parents' place to tuck my daughter into bed. And the next day, I received a call that turned my world further upside down. A mixture of disdain and pity filled my stomach as I learned about his plans to contest the arrangement, claiming that I was being unreasonable, uprooting her life further into chaos, twisting my act as malice rather than a mother's attempt to protect the sanctity that remained of our family. A loaded gun in a duel awaited. The stakes were high as whispers of the affair child began surfacing. Drama unfolding in circles I never intended to find myself in, my small town filled with scrutiny and judgment as I became the center of attention. The child was so innocent, I understood, but the way my husband was telling the story twisted everything about who I was. I was the villain now, the sinner who sought revenge on a child who knew nothing, and yet, I was right. It was an emotional roller coaster that left my heart wearied and precariously balanced as I battled courts for custody, justified my choices in front of their distorted glares, and braced for the war that would ensue when the affair child's mother decided to step forward, her blood-curdling screams echoing in the depths of my mind when she confronted me about taking their belongings, accusing me of silently cruel intentions as if I was the one who betrayed, as if I pulled the trigger first. It was easy to hate her as she bounced behind the emotions of being denied happiness, as I reminded myself she chose this life, while I had committed to ours. But things began to change when I heard my daughter whisper hauntedly through the air while she played with friends, "Is my room still there?" Maybe the futility of my actions were now painful in ways I hadn't anticipated as I realized I wasn't only uprooting my husband and the child he sired, but I was silently ripping apart my little girl's foundation, and that thought dug in. So a week passed, and I stood at my former home, staring at the pallid door, and my heart cracked open even wider. I bellowed open the front door, the darkness of the hallway overwhelmed me, and there it was, that echo of laughter carried down the walls, but no longer were they filled with her joy. My heart raced as I ventured past the living room to vanish into my daughter's realm of colors, and in that instant, I felt like a ghost. The furniture moved around so starkly it was as if I could feel nothing but despair seeping through the cracks, and what awaited was a mere glimpse of those toys that I had left behind. They remained discarded, callously tossed without care, and the sheer thought of my daughter being replaced by a child who should have never existed in this place stirred something inside me. It hit me then, I wasn't making a point, I was simply hurting an innocent. When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo? She said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. "You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear," she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal, Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. I never thought I'd be the one to ruin the holidays, but I guess that's what happens when your family decides you're the villain. It all started when Mom began to forget things, small things at first, like where she placed her knitting needles, but soon it escalated to missing important appointments and repeating stories just minutes apart. By the time the doctors finally agreed it was Alzheimer's, we were already deep into the annual holiday preparations, every single corner of the house smelling like cinnamon and pine, a stark contrast to the dread that settled in my stomach. My siblings and I had been discussing Mom's care for months, but every time we brought it up, Dad would brush us off, insisting she was just going through a phase. So, there we stood at the kitchen table that year, stuffing our faces with sugar cookies, debating the reality in front of us while Dad played Christmas music a little too loud to ignore the seriousness of the conversation. We finally decided it was time to take action. My sister and I felt like we had no choice but to push Dad to consider a long-term care facility, a decision that would forever alter the dynamics of our family. After weeks of pushing and arguing, we managed to find a place, one that seemed warm and welcoming, tucked away near a lovely, serene park. I'll never forget the look on Mom's face the day I took her there. It was a mix of confusion and unease, like she was suddenly stuck in a world unfamiliar to her. Sure, there were moments that broke my heart, when I heard her mumble under her breath about wanting to go home, or the way her hands trembled as she reached out for mine while we were walking through the facility's garden. Still, I convinced myself that it was the best decision for her. I didn't realize how my family would react until the holidays arrived. We gathered around the dinner table, laughter bouncing off the walls like the spirited carols playing in the background, but every joke fell flat when someone brought up Mom being in the facility. The looks exchanged, disapproving, hurt, cut deeper than any knife could. "You had to put her in there, huh?" My brother scoffed, mimicking the tone of someone relaying gossip, making a joke out of something that felt raw and broken. I asked him how he thought we could keep up with her needs when we could barely manage our own lives, and in response, he slammed his fists on the table, sending a glass of wine flying off the edge for it to shatter against the floor, the sound echoing in my ears like a tolling bell. Christmas night turned into a disaster. Dad left the table early, mumbling something about being sick, and my brother followed him, grumbling about how things used to be. My sister sat there, seemingly unaffected, but I could see the tears threatening to spill. I felt like I had placed a rift in our family's foundation, and it was my fault. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the remnants of that holiday meal, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. It was surreal watching myself shift from a devoted daughter into some distorted version attacking her own flesh and blood. That's when I heard it, soft, muffled whispers drifting from the living room where my family was gathered. Curiosity piqued, I leaned against the wall, straining to hear their words as well as the melancholy sound of the music filtering through the air. "I miss Mom, she was the glue," my sister said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't the way it's supposed to be." I stood frozen, panic swelling inside until I couldn't suppress it any longer. I was about to turn away when I heard my brother's voice, low and menacing, cutting through the sorrow. "She wrecked Christmas. We'll never forgive her." His words stung, and the darkness began to swell, an ugly, gnawing sensation crawling along my spine. For weeks after, all I heard from my siblings were passive-aggressive remarks about how I was to blame. They'd thrown holiday gatherings minus me, told stories that excluded any mention of Mom's current state, effectively rewriting history to make it look as though I wasn't even a part of this family anymore. I could have handled that, dealt with their hostility, but what I couldn't prepare for was that one icy January night a blizzard hit, forcing them to call me. Mom had fallen and needed to be rushed to the hospital. I couldn't breathe as I drove through the blinding snow, my heart racing faster than my car skidding across the icy roads. Arriving at the hospital, I was met with a wall of tension. My brother stood at the entrance, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding any eye contact, while my sister's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, the stress and guilt weighing down on all of us. When the doctor finally emerged with a grim expression, it became painfully clear I'd made the worst decision of my life. Mom had pneumonia. The long-term care facility had been negligent, failing to monitor her properly, allowing her state to worsen while we sat at home, too caught up in our family drama to notice. Standing in the stark waiting room, all the blame came crashing down on me like an avalanche. I was the villain in this warped version of our holiday story, and now, I held the key to her life in my hands. Days stretched into an eternity, and every minute was filled with tension. My siblings and I watched her fight for breath, whispering stories of how she used to bake cornbread on chilly afternoons or read us bedtime stories until we nodded off, hoping that somehow reaching into a happy past might bring back the woman we loved. Then, in a moment that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, her eyes opened briefly, and for a fleeting second, I swear I saw the spark of recognition, a glimmer of the warm, loving Mom I had known slowly fading. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, her breath becoming shallow as our family crumbled around her. A few weeks later, Mom was discharged, but she was not the same, lost in a fog of confusion and fear, like a wisp of smoke dissolving into the air. We decided to take her home, feeling that maybe familiarity would assist her recovery. As we settled into a grim routine, the guilt twisted deeper, roughening our laughter, suffocating our joy, and turning family moments into reminders of what we lost that fateful day I made an impossible choice. If anything good emerged from our turmoil, it was that my siblings and I finally united under an unspoken oath to never let the past repeat itself. We'd always check in on one another, foregoing the blame and the name-calling in the spirit of family. Yet the shadow of that holiday still hung over me, unrelenting and bitter, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly small decision, placing my mom in a facility, had led to our family's unraveling. We may not fully understand our roles in the eulogy of what once was, but I know one thing for certain: the holidays became unbearable, each year a haunting reminder of lost moments, with our lingering guilt festering into a dangerous concoction of shared grief and blame that can either bind us together or tear us apart all over again. So now, as I sit here, secretly shaking and desperately holding on to the hope that we can find a way back to some semblance of love and happiness, I question, am I the asshole for wanting to reclaim my family during this holiday season, or am I just a prisoner to my own mistakes, forever banished from the warmth that was once our reality? A few weeks ago, I found myself embroiled in a family feud that spiraled so quickly into something inexplicable, it still sends shivers down my spine. My cousin Amelia, who is a year younger than me, had a tendency toward excessive socializing, practically inviting half of our high school to any gathering we had, regardless of the time or place. But this year, Thanksgiving was at my parents' house, and after nearly 2 decades of noisy celebrations filled with the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie, I had my fill of her friends slumped on our couches or rummaging through the fridge, oblivious to any boundaries. So, when she announced excitedly that she was planning to invite her entire friend group over for Thanksgiving, I snapped. I told her she couldn't do that. "Amelia, this isn't a party, it's Thanksgiving," I said, my voice a mix of irritation and concern. With tears threatening to spill, she stormed off, muttering something under her breath, and I thought little of it at the time. Yet soon after, the atmosphere around the house shifted, as if a thick fog had rolled in uninvited. I dismissed it as the usual family tension, until the day before Thanksgiving, when everything escalated dramatically. That evening, I was alone in my room, scrolling through social media when I heard an unsettling sound, like the distant echoes of laughter and mingling voices, muffled by the walls. At first, I thought it was just Amelia, and maybe her friends had come over anyway. So I crept down the hallway, pausing at the top of the stairs, when suddenly, everything went silent, replaced by the haunting clang of silverware dropping to the floor. I think it's worth noting that it was almost midnight, yet the dining room lights flickered as if someone were playing tricks with the switch. Out of curiosity and more than a little fear, I tiptoed down, half expecting to find my family enjoying some last-minute preparations. To my utter confusion, the dining table was set for an extravagant meal, plates stacked, candles burning, but no one was there. A chill crept up my spine, and I suddenly felt like an intruder in my own home. I felt compelled to call out, "Hello?" But the words barely left my lips when I saw the centerpiece, a grotesque arrangement of wilted flowers, and beneath them lay a note in Amelia's unmistakable handwriting: "You shouldn't have done that." I froze, heart pounding, convinced it was some cruel prank. I backed away slowly, intending to bolt upstairs, but as I turned, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted past, quick and darting like a live thing. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I found myself paralyzed. It felt as if I were awaiting something profound. When I finally gathered the courage to rush back to my room, I slammed the door and locked it tight, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever I'd just witnessed at bay. That night, I hardly slept, plagued by uneasy thoughts filled with what festered between Amelia and me. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with an odd sense of dread I couldn't shake. As my family began to arrive, I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to engage in the usual small talk. Every now and then, I would glance toward the front door, half expecting a bustling group of Amelia's friends to barge in, but they never did. A creeping confusion and guilt gnawed at me as I remembered Amelia's tear-streaked face, that feeling of something undisclosed shared in those fleeting moments before she left. But when the dinner bell rang and we settled at the table, there was an emptiness around us that felt wrong. I hadn't noticed it before, but Amelia's absence cast a shadow over everything. Her seat lay conspicuously empty, and as the food was served, a hush fell over my family, like we were missing someone vital. I tried to swallow my unease, laughing at my uncle's jokes while the rest picked through their food absent-mindedly, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Amelia to walk in with a smile and an entourage. But she didn't arrive. During a quiet moment, I ventured the question everyone seemed hesitant to voice: "Where's Amelia?" My mom stiffened, and the air soured. "She canceled last minute," my dad muttered, eyeing me as if I were the cause of this mischief. A suffocating silence followed, and just as I thought the tension might snap, my younger brother piped up, "Hey, isn't that her car?" Our gaze turned toward the window, where the faint, unmistakable outline of Amelia's old Honda sat in the fading twilight. But Amelia didn't emerge from the vehicle, nor did anyone else. I felt a pang of worry shoot through me as I realized besides that strange note, I hadn't spoken with her since our argument. Just as I was about to suggest we check on her, a sudden shudder rattled the house, and the lights flickered ominously. For a heartbeat, everything went pitch black, and I could hear the muffled panic inside the house, my family's voices blending into a chaotic symphony of fear. When the lights returned with an angry flicker, our eyes found the windows, which revealed a reflection I'll never forget. There, pressed to the glass, was Amelia, her eyes wide and frantic, mouth moving as if she were screaming. But the sound. It didn't reach us. In that horrific moment, I felt something wrench inside my chest, a sense of cold accusation settling firmly in my gut. I didn't know what I'd unleashed by saying Amelia couldn't invite her friends. I lunged for the door, my heart pounding, but before I could escape, the house became agonizingly still. Drawing in a breath, unsure whether to feel more terror or dread, I realized something was terribly wrong, as if an uninvited guest had slipped silently into our home, something that lurked and stared from the corners of our lives. Thanksgiving dinner turned into a nightmare, family gathered around shivering in silence, while outside, the world was hushed, and the only sound was the echo of Amelia's voiceless scream. I never went outside that night, I was too scared, paralyzed by the unknown lurking just beyond the door. The next morning, without any explanation, they found Amelia's car empty and her gone, no trace of her anywhere. The police didn't find a single clue. As days blurred into weeks, no one ever spoke of her disappearance, and when I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother about her, all she would say was, "You shouldn't have asked her not to invite her friends." When Thanksgiving came around again a year later, the dread returned, settling on my shoulders like a curse. Amelia was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, it was all my fault. Even now, as the holidays draw near, I can't look at the empty chair where she used to sit at the table without feeling an icy sensation clawing at my insides. You might think it's just the guilt, but deep down, I know it's more than that. Those shadows cast by our family dinners have grown darker, something unseen digs into my gut, festering with secrets. And even today, I still hear her laughter echo through the walls, diluted yet almost tangible, taunting me like a warning of what happens when you tell someone they can't invite their friends for Thanksgiving. When my friend Sarah made the comment about my girlfriend Lisa being the token Asian, I felt the air grow thick with tension, as if someone had just whispered dark secrets in a crowded room, every eye quickly averting to look anywhere but at me. We were at a bar, surrounded by laughter and chatter, the kind of casual Friday night that usually brought the best out of people, but suddenly I felt like I was trapped in a scene of a horror movie where something sinister lurked just beneath the surface. I glanced at Lisa, who had been animatedly discussing her passion for pottery before Sarah's comments disrupted her flow, and her smile faded, replaced by a mask of confusion and hurt that twisted my stomach into knots. It was as if a storm had swept through, leaving only the debris of my friend's thoughtlessness behind, and I could sense anger rising in me, a primal reaction against the ignorance that seemed to lace Sarah's words. "What the hell did you just say?" I shot back, my voice a little louder than I intended, drawing the attention of nearby patrons who peered up from their drinks, eyes wide as they waited for the unfolding drama. The uncomfortable silence that enveloped our table felt electric, but I refused to let Sarah dismiss this as a joke, a little quip in what was supposed to be a friendly gathering. "You can't just say those things," I continued, heart pounding, the heat of embarrassment and rage pulsing through me, imagining Lisa's discomfort as if it were my own, the disbelief on her face cutting me deeper than any knife. Sarah's face turned a shade of red that echoed the shame she clearly wasn't feeling as she sputtered out a defense that made the situation worse, insisting she was just being funny and that I was overreacting. I thought about how Lisa had shared stories of her battles against subtle racism and microaggressions, the times she'd struggled to be seen as more than just a stereotype, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about a careless remark, it was about the ways society reduced people to labels and jokes that cut deeper than anyone could imagine. A palpable tension hung thick between us, as Sarah's entourage murmured awkwardly, clearly caught between wanting to support her and acknowledging that what she said was deeply out of line. I turned to Lisa, who was now looking down at her untouched drink, the smile that used to brighten her face replaced by an expression of disappointment, making my heart ache for her, wishing I could shield her from the ignorance I deemed unworthy of a real friend. When I shot Sarah a glare that must have conveyed 1,000 unsaid words, I noticed a flicker of realization cross her face, perhaps a brief moment where she understood the gravity of her insensitivity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. In a desperate attempt to reclaim the joviality of the evening, she tried to laugh it off, cracking a joke that fell flat in the thick air between us, but I could see the hints of defensiveness edging back into her demeanor, and I realized that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a window into the fractures of our friendship laid bare, like a raw wound festering under the guise of normalcy. I didn't want to confront her pride at the expense of my relationship with Lisa, but I couldn't sit there and pretend it didn't happen either. The evening curled into a ball of chaos, laughter replaced by awkward shifting in seats, as everyone seemed to tiptoe around me and Lisa, waiting for fallout that hung over us like dark clouds. I remember feeling the flame of anger cool slightly, churning into something deeper, a fierce protective instinct taking root in my chest, compelling me to stand up for Lisa not just because she was my girlfriend, but because she deserved to exist in a world that appreciated her complexity, her beauty, her cultural identity, rather than dismissing her as a punchline. "It's not a joke if it hurts someone else," I finally said, my voice softening but laced with steel, drawing Lisa's eyes toward mine, and in that pregnant silence, I watched as a shared understanding dawned on her face, a flicker of gratitude that made all the chaos worthwhile. Sarah huffed, her demeanor shifting from defensive to wounded, and I caught sight of tears brimming at the edges of her eyes, but I wasn't here to soothe her guilt, I was here to advocate for the woman I loved, and that was my priority until my last breath. The confrontation caught everyone off guard, turning their drinks into props in a tragic play unfolding right before them, and I thought about how desperately we cling to the comfort of ignorance, how the need to be liked sometimes makes us forget our humanity. The conversation wended onward, but it was clear that something had shifted irreparably. We finished our drinks and left, Lisa and I walking in silence through the night air that felt heavier than it had moments ago, but also liberating, as if in confronting the harsh absurdities of our reality, we unearthed a bond far deeper than I had imagined we were capable of sharing. As we reached the car, I could sense a beautiful understanding forging between us, and I dared to hope it might be a step towards healing the bruises that had marked both our hearts and our interactions in a world where sometimes, standing up means stepping away from the toxic comfort of friendship for the sake of love.